Marcus Allen leaned back in his office chair, staring blankly at the computer screen. The case he'd spent months working on had just ended in an unexpected and, in his eyes, unfair loss. He had done everything right, but it wasn't enough. And now he couldn't shake the anger and frustration that filled him. His fists clenched as he thought about how unjust the outcome was, no matter how hard he worked. Something always seemed to slip beyond his control, taunting him with a sense of helplessness he couldn't ignore. Marcus had built a life that looked successful by most standards. He was a respected lawyer in his mid-30s, working at a well-known firm in the city. He owned a modern apartment, drove an expensive car, and wore suits that fit him perfectly, but beneath the surface, he felt empty. For years, he'd been running on a constant loop, moving from one project to the next, driven by a need for validation and control. But the more he pushed, the less satisfaction he found. Each accomplishment felt hollow, each failure seemed magnified, and he was exhausted by the cycle. As he sat at his desk that night, one of his colleagues, Sarah, walked in. She looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. "You know, Marcus, I used to get so worked up over things just like this," she said gently, pulling a small book from her bag and setting it on his desk. "Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Reading this helped me find a bit more peace, especially when things didn't go the way I wanted. It's about stoicism, a philosophy that's all about accepting life as it comes and focusing on what you can control." At first, Marcus resisted. Philosophy seemed like a distraction from the real world, especially something as old-fashioned as stoicism. But later that night, after the office emptied out, he found himself thumbing through the worn pages of the book. There was something about the words that struck him as timeless, speaking directly to the frustration and emptiness he felt. Passages like "the happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts," and "you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He stayed up late into the night, reading not only meditations but also researching other Stoic figures like Epictetus and Seneca. He was captivated by the idea of focusing on inner virtue over external success, of finding tranquility through self-mastery and detachment from uncontrollable outcomes. He realized he had been living reactively, letting circumstances dictate his happiness. In that quiet moment, he made a decision. He would dedicate a week to practicing Stoic habits. If he could learn to cultivate resilience and calm, maybe he could break free from the constant grip of stress and find a sense of peace. Armed with determination, Marcus jotted down a list of 10 Stoic habits he'd practice daily. He would begin his journey the very next morning. The first morning of Marcus's Stoic experiment began early. He woke up before dawn, determined to set the tone for his day by practicing the first habit on his list. Morning reflection. Premeditatio malorum. Sitting quietly at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, he closed his eyes and mentally walked through the day ahead, imagining potential setbacks. He anticipated conflicts with coworkers, the possibility of a demanding client, or unexpected legal issues that might arise. Instead of dreading these events, he practiced accepting them as natural parts of life. This exercise, known in Stoic philosophy as premeditatio malorum, encouraged him to anticipate adversity without anxiety, to see challenges as inevitable rather than avoidable. However, the process was harder than he'd expected. His mind kept drifting, worrying about how to handle each imagined scenario, and he found himself resisting the idea of simply accepting difficulties. He noticed an intense urge to control the outcomes, even in his imagination. It frustrated him to realize how deeply ingrained his desire for control was, and he had to remind himself that Stoicism wasn't about achieving perfection in a day, but learning to let go over time. The second habit he practiced was 2. Gratitude for the present moment. Stoicism teaches the value of acknowledging life's transient nature and appreciating what we have in the present. With this in mind, Marcus took a few moments to silently list what he was grateful for. He thought about the basics: his health, his career, the ability to support himself. He even thought about his friends and colleagues who had supported him, especially Sarah, who had introduced him to Stoic teachings. It felt strange at first. He realized he had taken these things for granted in his constant push for more. This moment of gratitude left him feeling lighter, but also a bit disoriented. He realized how rarely he actually took the time to feel grateful, instead focusing on what he lacked or what he was pursuing. Still, he found this habit oddly calming, and he promised himself he'd continue it daily. Next came the third habit: 3. Daily affirmation of values. Marcus pulled out his notebook and wrote down the 4 cardinal virtues of Stoicism: wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Under each word, he reflected on how he might embody these values in his life. He committed to approaching his day with wisdom in his decisions, courage in facing obstacles, justice in his treatment of others, and temperance in controlling his impulses. Though he had always thought of himself as a morally upright person, this exercise forced him to confront areas where he'd fallen short. He felt a sense of accountability in writing these virtues down, knowing that his actions would either align with these values or betray them. However, he also felt the weight of the challenge ahead. Living in alignment with virtues was far more demanding than simply knowing them. The fourth habit was 4. Setting intentions for virtuous actions. With his values clear, Marcus identified one area of his life where he could apply these virtues. That day, he set the intention to practice patience and kindness with his colleagues, especially during the stressful moments that he knew would inevitably come. He wanted his actions to reflect the principles he was trying to adopt, rather than being dictated by his usual irritability. This habit turned out to be one of the most challenging, as it required him to be constantly mindful of his intentions. He realized how easily he lost patience or reacted impulsively, and each time he slipped, he felt a pang of disappointment. But he reminded himself that each moment was a new opportunity to act with virtue, and he pressed on. Finally, Marcus tackled the 5th habit: 5. Practicing detachment from outcomes. The core of Stoic philosophy is focusing on what we can control and letting go of what we cannot. For Marcus, this meant releasing his attachment to outcomes at work. He had to remind himself repeatedly that he could only control his actions, not their results. At first, it felt almost impossible. Every email he sent, every decision he made, he found himself obsessively wondering how it would be received or if it would lead to success. Detaching from these outcomes proved to be exhausting. The mental struggle to let go felt like a tug of war within him, between his Stoic aspirations and his ingrained need for control and validation. He began to realize how much of his stress and unhappiness stemmed from obsessing over things he couldn't change, and this understanding was both freeing and humbling. He knew that true detachment would take time, but he was committed to the practice. As the day unfolded, Marcus faced his share of challenges. His coworker accidentally deleted an important file, throwing a wrench into his carefully planned schedule. Normally, he would have reacted with frustration or blame, but he took a deep breath, reminding himself of the values he'd written that morning. He practiced patience, reminding himself that he couldn't control the mistake, only his response to it. By the end of the day, Marcus was both physically and mentally drained. The habits were simple in theory, but in practice, they demanded an intense level of awareness and restraint. He had to constantly remind himself of his intentions, pulling himself back from old habits of anger, impatience, and worry. As he sat at home that night, reflecting on his day, He felt a mix of frustration and quiet pride. He had faltered, but he had also succeeded in moments where he might normally have given in to negativity. He was beginning to understand the essence of Stoicism, that peace and resilience were forged through daily discipline, through choices made in moments of discomfort. Marcus knew that he had a long way to go, but he also felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in years, he felt like he was taking control not of his circumstances, but of himself. And that, he realized, was the beginning of a kind of freedom he had never known. By the third day of his Stoic journey, Marcus was already feeling the weight of the effort required to maintain these new habits. Each practice demanded intense focus, and each day felt like a tug of war between his old reactive tendencies and his new Stoic mindset. However, as he progressed, he began noticing subtle changes in himself, signs that the Stoic principles were taking root. After 3 days of practicing the initial habits, he introduced 3 more: 6. Moment-to-moment awareness, 7. Voluntary discomfort, practicing hardship, 8. Daily reflection on mortality, mental mortality. Mental mori, the 6th habit, moment-to-moment awareness, was simple but not easy. Marcus wanted to be aware of his reactions in real time, especially during stressful moments, rather than realizing them afterward. For example, when his assistant interrupted his work to ask about a trivial task, he could feel his irritation rise. He took a moment to recognize the sensation without letting it dictate his response. By simply observing his emotions, he was able to respond calmly, a change that surprised both him and his assistant. Marcus realized that practicing self-restraint was a form of strength he hadn't known he possessed. This small but powerful experience encouraged him, and he became more mindful throughout the day. He noted his desire to control situations, his frustration with slow responses from clients, and even his impatience with minor inconveniences. Each time he observed these reactions, he reminded himself that true peace came not from changing others, but from mastering his own mind. While he still felt his natural impulses, the practice of observing them without judgment gave him a sense of agency he hadn't experienced before. The 7th habit, voluntary discomfort, was perhaps the most physically challenging. Inspired by the Stoic belief in building resilience through self-discipline, Marcus decided to practice small acts of discomfort daily. He began by taking cold showers, forgoing his morning coffee, and choosing to walk rather than drive when possible. Initially, he found himself mentally resisting each choice, even resenting them. He missed the warmth of his morning shower and the ritual of his coffee. But he reminded himself of the purpose behind these practices, to train his mind to handle discomfort without complaint. Gradually, he started to notice a shift. His tolerance for discomfort increased, and he felt a newfound sense of control over his reactions. The practice taught him that he could face challenges without shrinking away, that comfort was often a distraction, and that resilience was built through daily acts of discipline. Voluntary discomfort, he realized, was teaching him to appreciate life's comforts without becoming dependent on them. The 8th habit, memento mori, or reflecting on mortality, became one of Marcus's most profound practices. Each evening, he would sit in silence and remind himself that life was fleeting, that each day could be his last. This practice wasn't intended to make him fearful, but rather to ground him in the present, reminding him of what truly mattered. Reflecting on his mortality made him more aware of how he spent his time, and he noticed himself becoming more forgiving of others and less attached to minor grievances. When he thought of his own impermanence, his usual concerns, work deadlines, client complaints, even small arguments seemed trivial. Instead of feeling weighed down by daily annoyances, he found a strange peace in realizing that, in the grand scheme of things, they didn't matter. Life, he understood, was too short to be spent on petty worries. One evening, as he was reflecting on mortality, Marcus felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for his relationships. He decided to reach out to his father, whom he hadn't spoken to in months due to a small family dispute. In the spirit of Stoic wisdom, he saw this as an opportunity to practice forgiveness and compassion. Their conversation was simple, but it brought him an unexpected sense of peace, reminding him of the value of humility and the healing power of connection. By the end of the week, Marcus had introduced the final two habits: daily acts of kindness and evening self-examination. Daily acts of kindness. Marcus committed himself to performing small, genuine acts of generosity without expecting anything in return. Whether it was helping a colleague with a task, buying coffee for a stranger, or simply giving a heartfelt compliment, each act was an opportunity to practice humility and gratitude. Through these actions, he realized that kindness wasn't just a virtue, but a practice that deepened his own sense of fulfillment. Each act reminded him of the Stoic value of justice, not just in a legal sense, but in treating others with fairness and compassion. The final habit, evening self-examination, became his anchor. Each night, he reviewed his actions and thoughts, assessing whether he had lived in alignment with his Stoic values. He noted moments where he had succeeded in staying calm and moments where he had allowed old habits to resurface. But instead of judging himself harshly, he saw each day as an opportunity to learn and grow. He sat down with his notebook, reading through his notes from each day and reflecting on the changes he had experienced. This journey hadn't been easy, but he had discovered a calm resilience he hadn't known he possessed. The 10 habits had not just changed his behaviors, but had reshaped his perspective. Through morning reflection, he learned that preparing for adversity gave him strength, reducing the impact of life's daily frustrations. Gratitude for the present moment had taught him to appreciate life's simple blessings, reminding him that happiness wasn't found in constant pursuit, but in the present moment. His daily affirmation of values kept him grounded in Stoic principles, while setting intentions for virtuous actions helped him embody these values through conscious choices. Practicing detachment from outcomes was a revelation. He realized that by focusing on what he could control and releasing attachment to the results, he freed himself from the constant anxiety and stress he used to feel. Moment-to-moment awareness showed him the power of restraint, teaching him to respond rather than react, and voluntary discomfort built his resilience, proving that he could handle discomfort without complaint. His nightly reflections on memento mori deepened his appreciation for life, while daily acts of kindness reminded him that true fulfillment lay in serving others. Finally, evening self-examination helped him see each day as a learning opportunity, making him more compassionate and patient with himself. As he closed his notebook, Marcus felt a new sense of purpose. He understood that Stoicism wasn't just a set of ideas, it was a way of life, one that required daily practice and commitment. The journey hadn't been easy, but the peace he felt was worth every challenge. That evening, he shared his experience with Sarah, the colleague who had introduced him to Stoicism. "Thank you for recommending that book," he said with a smile. "It was more than a philosophy. It felt like a guide to becoming someone I respect, someone who isn't ruled by anger or fear." Sarah smiled back. "I think that's what the Stoics meant by living with virtue. It's a journey, and you're just beginning." Inspired by his experience, Marcus decided to extend his commitment to Stoic practices beyond the week. He wanted to continue developing his inner strength and peace, knowing that each day was an opportunity to grow. He also felt a desire to share what he had learned, hoping to inspire others to explore Stoicism's timeless wisdom. In his journal, he wrote a final note to himself. True freedom lies not in changing the world, but in mastering one's own mind. Each day is a gift to live with purpose, humility, and peace. Call to action. In a moment of reflection, Marcus realized that others, too, might benefit from Stoic habits. He posted a short message on social media, encouraging anyone feeling overwhelmed or stressed to try practicing Stoic habits for a week. It might seem difficult, but the rewards are worth it, he wrote. Focus on what you can control, embrace challenges as teachers, and find peace within yourself. As he went to bed that night, Marcus felt a profound sense of contentment. He knew he still had much to learn, but for the first time in years, he felt truly free from the need to control everything, free from the burden of anger, and free to live a life of virtue. His journey was just beginning, but he was ready, one Stoic habit at a time.